Hello listeners, I'm Timstradamus and welcome back to another Paranormal Story Saturday. And with me is my talented and beautiful hostess Voyse.
Good evening, Timstradamus, and hello to all goblins and ghouls. Welcome to our eerie enclave of storytelling delights. Gather round and prepare to be enchanted by the spine-tingling stories that lurk in the darkest corners of the internet. My dear listeners, fasten your mortal coils and let your imagination dance with the supernatural as we embark on this enchanting journey through the realms of the mysterious and the macabre. But beware, for in this enchanted hour, even the cutest of tales may send a shiver down your spine.
I'm ready tonight.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Well, Timstradamus, to help take the edge off of some of these spooky stories, I've made you some hot cocoa to soothe that sweet tooth that you might have. And for any listeners following along, all story links are in the description below. For our first story, The Shadow Girl. I have an awful memory. First of all, I don't remember how old I was when I started seeing her. I don't know how old I was when it stopped. I hope she's happy now. To start off the story, I was no older than 12. I have a very distinct memory of seeing a little girl crying in black at the opposite end of the house from my room. She was by our washer and dryer and the bathroom with a working shower. When I took a shower, I had to leave the door open because it terrified me. I was always so frightened by her, but she never approached me, and when I saw her, I never approached her. I guess eventually I stopped seeing her, but that isn't the end of this girl's story. When I was about 16, maybe a little younger, I was really into playing with Ouija boards. Well, we weren't living in that house anymore. We were renting it out, and during a visit, we drew up a Ouija board, lit candles, grabbed the metal crucifix, and sprinkled salt around and on the board. At one point, I did the ritual alone. We talked to some spirits, I guess, but didn't get many answers we were hoping for, so I asked for permission to look through the glass, and there's no answer. So we go around the board, taking turns asking. Eventually, this gets boring, and I just pick up the piece. To be completely clear, I personally didn't see anything, but I also had never told anyone about the crying little girl until after this incident. We took turns looking around the room through the Ouija board piece. Nobody saw anything until we got to the twin sisters, Kaylee and Tiffany. Tiffany looked through and didn't see anything. Then Kaylee looked around the room. When she looked in the corner behind me, she dropped the piece, screamed really loud, and ran crying down to the end of the hallway where she crouched and cried next to the washer and dryer. She saw a shadow girl with black hair crying in the corner behind me.
Okay, so someone else saw the girl that OP had said they saw.
Correct.
And they were messing around with a Ouija board.
Probably the best idea not to mess around with those things.
I've never messed with it. My grandmother had a pretty wicked experience with a Ouija board. A story for another time.
Another time?
Yeah, it's creepy.
Oh no. So our OP actually put down in the comment section that their neighbors found a 7-foot tall Native American skeleton in their backyard. And then to add to that, they actually put their location. They said they're in Harris, Arkansas, and a lot of eerie things tend to happen in their area.
Well, I mean, if they're saying that they may have been in a Native American burial ground, that's probably the start of something bad. Isn't that what all the spooky stories start with?
I don't mess with any of that. So let me go ahead and actually read to you part of our OP's comment to flesh some things out. They said, "My father still lives there, and I am happy to say I'm gonna be building a house on his hill. I do think the girl is still there, and there has always been a weird vibe. The valley itself is always cold at night, and sometimes flashlights and cameras will malfunction." Dun dun dun!
Yeah. Like I said before, I don't think I can recall any time I've wanted to or have messed with a Ouija board. So I've heard many different things about it, though, whether or not it's true or not. I've never experienced it for myself, so I can't really speak to that experience, but I will say that I will never attempt it. I respect it enough to not mess with it. That's probably the best way I can put that.
Well, let's go ahead and go into our next story and see what you think about all of this. It's called The Haunted Tours Stories.
Ooh.
I used to give haunted tours of an old town. I used to be a guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 to 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the vast majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders with a paranormal twist added at the end with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script. Don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour, which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. Story 1. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now, these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, ranging in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off. That's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard, nobody buried there in at least 100 years. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights and scare themselves shitless. But one night, as they were wandering, a man called me over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look and saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF detector over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over this grave and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about the grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name, Thomas, was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group, 5 people, leaning over it at this point, trying to read it, when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted, "Wally!" As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time, as was my habit every once in a while, since nobody visited that place anymore. Story 2. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun/got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged the bit because, hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3, mother, father, daughter, and an older man who I initially thought was Grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore. This was years ago. But one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted into to this day. And he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if the ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. Old man came to give me that typical handshake, and mentally, I was thinking that all his weird behavior could be easily forgotten if he tipped well. The handshake was normal, except that his hand was ice cold, but old folks have cold hands, so I didn't think about it too much, except he didn't palm me $1. He palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $50 when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill, and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second, and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home and looked up the coin, I learned it was a 1 troy ounce silver bullion, minted to an older year. I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed he was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3.
Hold the phone. You can't just go on after that. So he's saying on his tour that he was giving, an older gentleman was just there, gave him a coin, and then he wasn't.
Correct. He just walked past him, and I guess when he realized he put a coin in his hand, turned around, and the old man was gone. And the family were really weirded out by the guy because he called their daughter by name, but they don't know who this man is.
Solid ghost story.
Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced, which really set my beliefs of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our tour was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back on its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we have got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside of the cabin. The cabin is kept locked up with a padlock at all times, except when the Historical Society opens it up for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside, and most of the time it's too dark to get a decent look inside anyway. Regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood because they'd psych themselves into thinking they saw something move, and a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night, after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids, 13 to 16, usually think it makes them cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared, so he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume. That was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course, I had to have a look. So I peeked through, and sure enough, a street light was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffuse sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast because, quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched. But I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked inside again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again, or any old woman for that matter. So anyway, those are my stories. I know they aren't as sensational as some, but I thought I'd share my experiences with you all. I have a few more odd stories that I can share if you like, but they're all more explainable by mundane means, if not still creepy and odd. So, Timstradamus, would you like for me to read to you a couple more of their stories?
Oh, they gave some more?
They did.
Oh, that's fantastic. And by the way, they don't sound mundane to me. I actually enjoy hearing this. It doesn't have to be over the top. I actually appreciate them more when they're not over dramatized, because then it leads it to be a little more believable for me. But that's just me.
I can definitely understand. It's good to be a little skeptic.
I hate rocking chairs, by the way. The second you said that, I'm like, oh, no.
You don't want to imagine her in the corner rocking?
No, I hate rocking chairs.
Oh, well, let's go ahead and go to this extra story and see what you think about this one. All right. I've already told most of my good ones, but hopefully this one is still interesting. On the night this happened, I had 2 tours in a row. This gets more common the closer you get to October because we start having more tours booked than we can facilitate. So the first one would run from 8 to 9 or 9:30, and the second one would end sometime around 10:30 or so usually. I always offer to walk my tours back to their cars afterward. The city's pretty safe, but it's confusing in the dark. However, it does have a nightlife, and sometimes they would decline because they wanted to hit a bar afterward or keep exploring the cemetery. I'd let them do as they pleased, so if they weren't interested in going back with me, I'd make the walk back alone. This was one of those times, and it was for a later tour which had run over, so it was probably around 10:45 when I started walking back to my car. It's a lonely walk through some pretty looking but odd areas of town to get from the cemetery to the parking garage that I knew wouldn't check your ticket. I bought 1 ticket and just used it over and over again. So I was on my way back from what would normally be a 15 to 20 minute walk, and everything seemed totally normal to me until I got in the car. When I got in and started it up, I glanced at the clock and it was 12:01. I double-checked my phone. 12:01. I have no idea how it turned a 15 to 20 minute walk into over an hour. I thought maybe I left the tour later than I had thought. I always texted my boss when the tours were over so she knew to mark me as clocked out. Check the text, 10:47. I wish I could say there's more to it than that, but that's the whole story. Somehow, without stopping at any point in my walk and going at what seemed to be my standard pace, I arrived at my car an hour later than I should have. I have made that walk hundreds of times, and every other time it's taken me 15 to 20 minutes. I just don't get it. It makes me wonder, you think he leapt through time?
Or he took his sweet time walking.
He could have.
But that does have you pondering. He says he's done that walk a whole lot.
And it's in the dark. He says it might be pretty, but it's still pretty dark. I can't imagine that there would be much to look at.
How peculiar.
Well, let's go ahead and head into our last story from our Haunted Tours guide.
Oh, he gave another one?
One more story.
Wow, people really like to hear from him.
Oh, yes. All right, here's another. It isn't as obviously paranormal as the others listed here, but it was really weird. I had a group of 5 women with me that night, and to be honest, they were all drunk. It was some kind of bachelorette party, I think. This is pretty standard. There are a lot of wineries up there, and it's pretty common that folks get wasted well before the tours start. As usual with a group like this, I was careful to keep an eye on everybody. We walk by a river at one point in the tour and go past a couple other places that could make for a pretty nasty fall. And the last thing I want is a drunk tourist getting lost on my watch. So I took mental note at the start of the tour of how many folks I had in my group. And after every stop, I took a quick head count to make sure that all 5 women were still with us. They all seemed to have a great time, as folks often do when they're drunk and hearing ghost stories. Kept asking me questions about scary things I'd seen, and we're a very engaging group. The tour came to a close, and they were generous tippers to boot. I was in high spirits, and I wanted to make sure they all made it back to their hotel okay, so I offered to walk them back. They accepted, so I took a brief detour on my walk home to take them back to their hotel. As they were going in, I did one last head count and got 4 women. I was pretty alarmed and asked them all if they had seen where their friend got off to. All 4 women swore their group was always 4 and that there wasn't a 5th woman. I could swear on anything that there were 5 of these girls. All 5 were chatting, joking, engaging with one another. No loners that maybe just wandered into our tour. I counted 5 heads at least a dozen times over the course of the tour. I double-checked their tour ticket, and sure enough, there were only 4 of them on the registry. But I know there were 5 of them. I passed out 5 EMF detectors. I know I did. It still confuses me. It could have just been my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe they lied to save money on tickets, but it was odd.
That's when you say you're running your AC too hard. As my father used to tell me to distract me away from the paranormal stuff that was going on in our home.
I can't say I've ever had a paranormal experience quite like that.
Very cool. This guy sounds like a very awesome tour guide.
Oh, definitely. I wish I knew where this tour guide was.
I would understand keeping anonymity and all of that.
All I know is it's in Tennessee.
I don't think we've ever gone on a haunted ghost tour before, but at some point, hopefully we'll be able to do one. They sound interesting.
It would be pretty interesting and pretty fun to try out. So which one of our haunted tour guide stories really creeped you out?
I don't know if any of them necessarily creeped me out, but I do think the one where the older gentleman gives him a coin is kind of cool.
I think that's...
Actually, no, I take that back. It's the old lady in the rocking chair.
For me, I like the story with the old man. I think if you had that experience and you literally kept that coin, it would forever be a reminder of what an interesting occurrence you just went through.
Maybe it's the entrance fee to something later on.
Possibly.
Well, was that our last spooky story?
That was our last spooky story. Don't forget, always watch for the unusual, perceive the extraordinary, keep your mind awake and your eyes open, listeners. If you have enjoyed listening to us read and talk about today's stories, please rate, subscribe, or follow and turn on notifications for new content. We usually do all of our postings on AITA items, but we would love to know what you think about these spooky stories.
Well, if you have any paranormal stories of your own, please feel free to email them to us. Maybe we'll read them on the channel.
Yes, we definitely love hearing about all kinds of different stories, whether it be on the AITA side or on the paranormal side.
And remember, if you post it, maybe we'll see it on the internet.
Are you sure you don't want us to get a rocking chair?
Absolutely not.
Aww.